thank you all very much, all three of you. It was really compelling presentations and a great panel. I have two specific questions. The first is for Dinah. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the gender of the interviewers. Tell us a little bit more about that. It's particularly interesting to me. And for Melinda, I was very interested in the walking memorial. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about that specific location and maybe a little bit more about how common these are, when they started, and so forth. So those are my two questions. But I thank all three of you. It's been a fantastic session.
Yes, I would like to ask something because I was wondering while listening to especially Dinah? Yes? Dinah? Yes, okay. As lecture, because you speak of gender violence. And first thing is that you, in nearly all these quotes from the testimonies, the Russians are meant. Yes? Are mentioned, the Russians.
In this particular piece, yes.
Yes. But I know it from my research, and for example, Ravensbrück was liberated by the Russians, but in the end, they were not Russians. Yes, they, for example, I'm in an exhibition project. It's also there's a large issue of female Holocaust survivors being raped by the Russians, but in the end, they were Ukrainians. It was the first Ukrainian front. So I would be maybe, how can I say this, careful with this narrative of the Russians, because I know it from my own family history. It were always the Russians, but in the end they were Lithuanians, or they were Latvians, and also on. And there's a large book in Germany. It's unfortunately only in Germany, because when you follow the death marches from the east, all these camps were liberated by the Soviet army. But if you look at Natzweiler and all these camps in the west, these were British, these were Americans, and there's a large study in German about rapes by Americans and British troops. This is one thing. And the other thing is that, I mean, I only know it also from my research, when I researched about children in concentration camps. Gender violence, it's maybe also a question to Martha, is most of the time, 99% associated to women. Yes, but there is a large issue of teenage boys being raped, being molested, either in camps or in Siberia. For example, I have some SS administrative files from Monowitz, and even the SS there was looking for these people who raped teenage boys, and I have the files, and by coincidence I found the survivor testimony in the Shoah Foundation interviews. And this guy is not mentioning at all that he was raped by a man. Because you said it was weak, fearful, and unmanly, and so on. Because, and I even know it from men, non-Jewish men in Germany who were raped by, I don't know, in Berlin, by Russians, again, Russians, yes. And so this is maybe also missing, because I think, of course, it's right to research on women and the female Holocaust survivors and so on, but I think especially these teenage boys, I don't know how it is about small children, I only know it from these 12, 13, 14-year-old boys.
Thank you. It's to Melinda. You talked about how testimony is used to either trigger a memorial or used in a memorial. Just in terms of my research, the Kinder transportees also use their testimony in and around memorials for commemoration or due to other events such as a protest or something like that. And I just wondered if there's any sort of examples of Hungarian survivors talking about their testimony in or around memorials, and using testimony, their testimony to, I suppose, remembering the past to responding to the present by remembering the past, sort of drawing connections between, I don't know, their experiences and the present refugee crisis or something like that, if there are any examples there.
Okay, so maybe we'll start with those three. Whoever wants to go first.
Do we use this?
Yeah.
This? Love. Tori, thank you for your question. This is actually an excellent question because it's only something that I've recently started paying attention to. As I said just very briefly here, I wasn't looking for this topic. I sort of found it when I was working on women and girls in the Baltic ghettos. It's something I started paying attention to when I just started recently working with a collection at the Latvian Museum of the Occupations, because there's a primary male interviewer and a primary female interviewer, and I've noticed some differences. And it's hard to attribute this to gender. It can also be personality, but in terms of interruption, right? Is there patience with someone telling a story? Is it interrupted? There are some instances that I notice, and it's always hard to attribute motivation, but it's certainly the case that in some instances where a survivor brings up, in these stories, brings up sexual violence, that it creates a little bit of palpable discomfort. You know, it's discomfort on the part of the speaker, but it's also discomfort on the part of the interviewer, and sometimes there's a little bit of a shift to, so you were talking about this also, you know, sort of a shift back to some other topic instead of pursuing that topic further. I do not have a good answer for you, but the question is an important one, and one that, because I sort of dug into this before I was asking questions like that, I need to look into, and I think it's an important question. I'm not sure if I'll have a good answer to it, and I don't have one now, but I do appreciate you asking. I'll just answer the other question quickly. Also, with respect to the term Soviet, or respect to the term Russian, in these, I try to, you know, I use the specific exactly as the survivor has indicated. I try to be careful with using Soviet because, yes, I mean, as someone who has also written on the Latvian national divisions, I'm certainly aware that everyone in the Red Army was not Russian. But it's a complicated issue with respect to using Russian and Soviet interchangeably. In my own narration of it, I try to use Soviet. Sometimes I make a mistake, I'm sure. But almost invariably in the survivor testimonies, if they're speaking of the liberators, they speak about them as Russians, although I realize that not all of them were.
For example, Auschwitz was liberated also by Ukrainians and
the
white
first
Russians
Ukraine
and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is how they, you know, that's their story. Gendered violence is also a term, I'll just answer very quickly, that I use in other chapters, not only to talk about sexual violence. I mean, there are other forms of gendered violence, certainly in the ghettos, where forced abortions, you know, sterilizations, these are forms of gendered violence. And you know, for example, with sterilization, that also attaches to men. So in the larger project, I try to use it in a more, you know, in a broader way. Thank you for the questions.
May I say a couple words about men and boys as victims of sexual violence? Recently was published article actually precisely about male victimization during the Holocaust, and now this topic is more and more visible, and we know that to study this topic, so it's even more difficult because men are less even willing to talk about this, because all these, you know, masculinity issues, because all these, you know, images of manhood and so on. But we know that many men were faced sexual violence during the Holocaust as well. They were castrated. Some of them were humiliated. I also found the testimonies from Borislav ghetto in Ukraine, where teenage boys was actually provide sexual favor to a German officer in order to survive. And also my last case from Bar, Grigorian Drusiv, there is testimony in this file, in this criminal case. One of the witnesses actually was Jewish man. He was at this time in 42. He was approximately about 40 years old, and he accompanied two Jewish girls to the police station, where two SS men actually were waiting for entertainment. and all of them actually were forced to strip naked, all of them. But when he is giving testimony, he suddenly interrupts himself and didn't mention what happened to him. But he described what happened to those girls. They were raped. I was forced to clean their legs from blood and so on. So, but he was also, he started his story. We were all together. We were forced naked. So he hid this story. What happened to him? And in other testimonies of survivors, we also see those lines of silence. So they mention something, but then they suppress their memories, that they prefer to keep silent. But men actually now are more visible also as victims of and survivors of sexual violence, also in terms of secondary victimization, because those men who witnessed their wives, their daughters, their sisters, their neighbors, classmates being raped, actually now in terms of today's study, we determine them as secondary victims or secondary survivors of sexual violence. So this topic is, but now it's more addressed.
Thank you, and also thank you for the questions. I realize it's already lunchtime, so I try to be super quick, but happy to discuss all the details with anyone during the lunch, but I don't want anyone to suffer in a testimony conference, it doesn't work. So, about this walking memorial, it's a very unique example because on one hand there are so many similar examples if you just look at the fact of walking and like directed walks. Yes, there are many. We all know, like also like walking by the locals. It's a new touristic marketing thing, but calling it's a memorial is a unique thing. So the whole story started with an idea of there was an initiation by a civil organization, if I remember well of my research on that, is that we should have a memorial here because there used to be a camp there. But then the locals didn't really wanted to have that, and there was also not really a physical space for that. So this civil organization tried to have a discussion with the locals and come up something that is acceptable by both parties in a way, if you could call them. And so that's why I find it unique, because it's in a way bottom up. If you, I don't know, well, if someone from the outside proposing a memorial, I don't know how much is it like bottom up, but at least it has multiple actors in its inauguration, and also by the fact it's multivocal. And I really like the fact that when you go back, you have to complain. And I read the comments. It's not really a museum book, but like the experiences that they said. Every time I come, I noticed, or I pay more attention to certain voices, not all of them. So it's always not a different story. You hear the same, but you realize it depends on how tired you are, what is your personal mood. So all these things add to the experience, which I find it very useful and special. So it might be a bit of exaggeration, but they call it memorials, so I have kind of the privilege to use it as a possibility, or at least I feel that I can. Regarding the current examples, well, it's a complicated question. If we speak about context, which we always do, you have to know that in Hungary, before 1989, all these commemorations next to memorials was, top down and kind of mandatory. So people really don't like to go commemorating events next to memorials anymore, but there are examples. Also, you have to have permission from local authority if you wanted to do any kind of event on a public space. So usually it's not like we would like to have a march pro-refugees next to this and that memorial, of course. But for example, I did participate on many of the commemorations next to the Roma Holocaust Memorial, and of course, it's always mentioned how the Roma community is. What are the, how should I say in a politically correct way? What are the challenges they are still facing in our contemporary society? So yes, but this is, you know, an officially Roma Holocaust Day commemoration, and they commented on that. Also, the example, what our colleague mentioned, the counter memorial next to this not really nice memory we have about the, how should I say, German occupation, whatever. I would love to speak about it because that's like, I think, the first point of Budapest, at least, and it's against history and blah, 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 blah. But it's really good that there is and still existing counter monument. It's a bottom-up initiative. I don't think that there are events or testimonies as often as it used to be at the beginning, but still you have all those texts you can read. All those texts are also in English, which is always a big issue of how you wanted to speak anything in Hungarian. I mean, none except us speak that language, so you have to have foreign language to include it.
Thank you very much.